Welcome. My name is Liliana Rojas Suarez, and I'm the director of the Latin America Initiative here at CGD. Today, I'm delighted to host a conversation on a crucial topic for Latin America and the Caribbean. How serious is the region's setback in terms of reductions in poverty and inequality resulting from the ongoing effects of the COVID-19 crisis? And what can policymakers do to contain or even reverse the damage to social and economic progress? To motivate the discussion, we have with us today Felipe Jaramillo, the World Bank Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean, who will present the results from the bank's recent report with an appropriate but very disturbing title: The Gradual Rise and Rapid Decline of the Middle Class in Latin America and the Caribbean. Following Felipe's presentation, we have a very distinguished panel with us today that will join in the discussion. In alphabetical order, let me present the three of them. First, Francisco Chico Ferreira, who is the Amartya Sen Professor of Inequality Studies and Director of the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Then is Nora Lustig, the Samuel Z. Stone Professor of Latin American Economics and founding director of the Commitment to Equity Institute, the well-known CEQ at Tulane University, and also a non-resident fellow here at CGD. And last but certainly not least, Máximo Torero, the chief economist of FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. In addition to this discussion, we also have time scheduled for a Q&A section with our audience. So to everybody watching live, please submit your questions in advance, during our conversation and presentation, by commenting in the YouTube chat window, or you can also tweet at CGDEP and using the hashtag CGD Talks, or you can also email your questions to events@cgdep.org. Finally, we have another housekeeping issue, is that we also have simultaneous translation in Spanish. For those of you interested, you can find the link in the YouTube chat window. All right, now we are really ready to start. Without further ado, the virtual floor, or maybe I should say virtual window, is yours, Felipe.
Thank you, Liliana. And good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending upon where they are. It is my pleasure to open this panel discussion with this very distinguished panel of experts and colleagues. I'm very happy to see some of my old friends here, and I am sure we're going to have a great discussion. Today, we're launching this report called The Gradual Rise and Rapid Decline of the Middle Class in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is aimed at helping us see what the numbers say about the magnitude of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on poverty, inequality, vulnerability, and the middle class in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our region is at a crossroads. As you probably all have heard, the region has been disproportionately affected by this pandemic and by the crisis caused by the pandemic. Many countries are still struggling to contain the virus as we speak. Our region only has about 8% of the global population, but has borne 20% of the COVID infections, and sadly, over 30% of the accumulated deaths. Even today, LAC continues to be in many ways the epicenter of the pandemic, especially South America. The depth of the health crisis has been matched by the largest economic recession ever on record, on aggregate, Our calculation is that the economy of the region contracted by 6.5% in 2020. This is the sharpest contraction since we've been keeping data, which dates back to the very early 1900s. And this year, 2021, we expect a rebound, maybe about 5%, but this will be insufficient to return to the GDP levels that the economies had in 2019. The impact of this pandemic and the broader crisis that it has spawned is particularly concerning on poverty and on other indicators of social progress. For most of the indicators in the majority of countries, progress has been reversed back many years. In some cases, over a decade of gains have been erased. And despite attempts to mitigate the worst impacts, the vast majority of our countries have seen a deepening of poverty levels, an increase in inequality, and an erosion of the middle class. Unfortunately, the impacts have been very severe on the most vulnerable groups, rural populations, historically excluded groups like Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples. And in addition, there is an important gender angle to this crisis, as women have suffered disproportionately from reduced jobs and incomes, and gender-based violence rates have spiked. All these results sadly coming in stark contrast with the broad gains displayed in the region since 2000 and until at least 2014 or so. The region had managed to reduce poverty by half. In that period, inequality had improved in quite a few of the countries, and many of those that were lifted out of poverty and out of vulnerability had been able to enter the middle class. In fact, in 2018, for the first time ever in our region, the number of households classified as middle class was larger than the number of households living in either poverty or vulnerability. I am concerned with some potential long-lasting impacts of this pandemic. The most worrisome is what has been happening in education. For most of 2020 and a good part of 2021, many of the children of our region have been out of school. Some may never return. We calculate that at least 170 million students of all ages have been affected. A recent World Bank study quantified the future impact and calculates that about $24,000 in future income might be lost for each one of the children that have lost a lot of the learning content over the last year and a half. And of course, the students from the poorest sectors are the ones who lose the most. So we are also concerned about the long-term impacts on increased malnutrition and hunger in some areas of Latin America, big losses in human capital. But let me end with some positive news. Despite these shockwaves that I've laid out, there are at least two positive trends I want to leave you with. First is that on the one hand, the external environment has improved significantly in recent months. Global trade has now surpassed pre-pandemic levels. Growth in China and growth in the US are fueling a surge in demand globally that is translating into higher prices for many primary products. This is giving already much needed breathing space to the battered economies of Latin America. And second, if you look into the numbers of what has been happening over the last year and a half, you can also notice that this has been a time of unprecedented structural transformations quietly occurring or accelerating. This crisis seems to have brought on a surge of high productivity sectors, including ICT, finance, logistics. And the use of digital technologies has accelerated and promises to change the way Latin Americans work and the way they get their education, their health, their finance, and many other areas in which this has become absolutely critical. Sadly, not everybody is benefiting from this, but it does show that there are new production and employment opportunities that our region needs to take advantage of. And I am convinced that the region's future prosperity and social progress will very much depend on the way Latin Americans and their leaders manage to turn these opportunities into real opportunities for all. Thank you very much. Over to you, Liliana.
Thank you so much, Felipe. Very concise but extremely rich presentation of the report. And we are certainly in the discussion we're about to start going to be discussing many of the issues that you have raised in your initial remarks. So let's start the conversation with a question to Nora. Nora, there has been a large diversity among Latin American countries in social protection policies targeted to the most vulnerable populations. You have studied extensively the impact and effectiveness of these policies in a number of countries in the region. Can you give us your views, your sense about how these policies will shape the poverty outlook in the region?
Yes, thank you very much, Ileana, first of all, for being part of this distinguished panel. And as I said earlier, I really enjoyed, I mentioned that to Felipe, that I really enjoyed the report. So congratulations to the bank. It's quite interesting. And I think it's going to create quite a bit of discussion because some of the results probably are unexpected. They show that for the region as a whole, poverty might have fallen in 2020, which is something that people will probably say, what? How is that possible? Well, it turns out, and this is related to your specific question, is that it's primarily driven by Brazil. I know Chico is going to abound on Brazil, but I want to make a very important contrast in terms of what's happened. Well, first of all, I always start my comments by saying Latin America as an entity really doesn't exist. There's so much heterogeneity in characteristics and policy responses that one has to really be very careful about making sweeping statements that affect the entire region. In particular, in terms of their response, we saw some of the largest macroeconomic packages in the region, among those in Brazil, but also in your country, Liliana, and Maximo's country, and some of the smallest, like in Mexico. Mexico did not introduce countercyclical policies, and so it didn't have really any countercyclical safety nets in place to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. There were some subnational efforts and maybe very, very small efforts more on the productive side to try to cushion the impact, but Mexico is an outlier in terms of the response to the shock that the pandemic meant. So what you see is that the two extremes play out very differently then in terms of the poverty outcomes. In the case of Brazil, the programs that were implemented were so high in coverage and also in terms of the size of the transfer is so large that actually inequality, not only poverty, according to our estimates, in 2020 may have been lower than what it was previously. In contrast, in Mexico, what you see is it's going to be the country with the largest number of new poor, and it's a large country, so you would expect that to begin with, because any percentage point increase, that's going to result in millions. But even if you control for that, it is a country that shows the highest increase both in inequality and poverty. We have studied in more depth also to other countries, Argentina and Colombia. So Argentina is also, if you want, closer to Brazil in terms of implementing large-scale response, and it has been able to mitigate, but not to the extent that Brazil did. And in the context of Colombia, the implementation of counter-cyclical safety nets was also there, but smaller, and therefore the increase in poverty, even though mitigated, it's still higher than what it's observed in the sort of place where this was completely counteracted. But since you want to focus also on the middle class, I think it's important to mention that we have studied how the effect of both the shock and then the safety nets that were introduced to mitigate have affected people throughout the distribution. And what you can observe is that it's neither the bottom nor the top. It's like a U-shaped effect, in which really starting from, let's say, the moderate poor, the vulnerable, and the middle classes are the ones that probably experience the largest contractions or the least mitigation in the context of Brazil. So the middle classes have borne, relatively speaking, in absolute terms, too, but what happens to the poor is always more concerning because any loss is very damaging to people that are poor. But in relative terms, the middle sectors are the ones that probably have suffered the largest brunt of the effect. So let me stop here.
Thanks a lot, Nora. That was, again, concise, but to the point. So, Chico, let's follow up on the question to Nora, but with the focus on Brazil that Nora mentioned. Brazil is a country that the World Bank report points as an outlier, as an exception in social protection policies in the region. And this is specifically due to strong transfers programs. Brazil actually contained the increase in poverty during the pandemic and even lifted some population from poverty. How sustainable do you think these gains in poverty reductions are? But before you answer, let me ask everybody to actually turn your mics off because there is some sound coming, some background sound. Chico, your answer.
Thanks. I think the background was coming from me because somebody muted me, but now I'll unmute myself. Thanks, Liliana. And like Felipe and Nora, just to say thanks very much for the opportunity to be in this great panel with lots of friends and colleagues. I'll also say just briefly that it's very sort of sad to read this report about the decline of the middle class in Latin America, having been one of the authors of a World Bank report that came out in 2013, which was entitled Economic Mobility and the Rise of the Latin American Middle Class, where we introduced a number of these definitions of vulnerability and middle class that are still being used. And back then, in the conclusion, we said many things, but one was that all of these gains remain very vulnerable to negative shocks. And of course, sadly, this is what has come to pass with a massive shock in the form of the pandemic, erasing those gains almost everywhere. Now in Brazil, it was a very generous package last year. In particular, it was 600 reais, which is now about $120 to $140 maybe at nominal exchange rates per person. So for one person and up to two people in households. There's a combination of generosity, which itself has an interesting political story of a coalition between lots of really well-meaning and technically well-informed civil servants and public servants and people in Congress with an administration that really didn't believe in the pandemic at all, didn't care about the health responses at all, but sort of saw an opportunity basically to win popularity by adopting this. So there was an interesting political coalition there behind that as well. Of course, it's much less generous now. You ask if it is sustainable. So fiscally, the overall package is not sustainable. We, last year had a fiscal deficit in the order of 15% of GDP. This year, it's expected to be in the order of 8% of GDP as a fiscal deficit. Our debt to GDP ratio is above 90% now. So Brazil is as we all know in this room here, in this virtual room, in a very vulnerable fiscal situation, and it is translating into inflation. You know, we live in an epoch where people believe that those links between money supply and fiscal expenditure and inflation have completely been broken. Well, they haven't. I don't think they have really pretty much anywhere, to be completely honest. But certainly not in Brazil. Inflation in the last 12 months has been 8%. The inflation target is at 3.75%. That said, the fact that the situation as a whole isn't sustainable doesn't necessarily mean, oh my God, Brazil shouldn't have made these expenditures and they now must retrench them. Because we also spend much more money on things which are less useful and less well targeted, right? For decades, we've been talking about how we subsidize pensions, very high pensions of civil servants and the military and other categories. We spend way too much in what's so-called fiscal expenditures, so sort of tax breaks for various companies and so on. So if you look at the overall pattern of Brazil's government spending, I would say there are many other things one could cut and should cut in order to restore fiscal balance without necessarily having to look at without having to cut social assistance to the poor. The final thing I'll say is that, of course, the design of social assistance going forward shouldn't be this emergency benefit, which was clearly an emergency benefit. We need to go back to the initial design of Bolsa Familia, which was never fully completed into what it was meant to be. It was meant to be a more universal insurance system that also had mechanisms for families without children that weren't sending their children to school, which are the people who benefit from Bolsa Familia initially. Now less so. So there's scope for looking at redesign and so on and so forth. So to conclude, the overall fiscal package is not sustainable, but that doesn't mean that money needs to come away exactly from these kinds of transfers to the poor. They just need to be redesigned to be more effective and efficient.
Chico, thank you so much. Let me just dig a little bit deeper into what you just said, since you introduced some macroeconomic elements. Brazil right now, the policymakers, the central bank is increasing interest rates, as you know, to actually combat what you very well mentioned is some surge in expectations of inflation. Do you think that combined with the effects of the pandemic could actually put the brakes on these improvements in poverty, even if Bolsa Familia were to be redesigned, implemented? Do you think that coming up, or is not really an issue right now?
No, I think Brazil has a systemic growth challenge problem. We've been underperforming in growth terms for a long time. Our forecasts for this year are lower than the forecast for the region that Felipe mentioned. So I think, restricting monetary policy in the way that you've just described it, may well have an impact on employment and so on. But that is not a reason not to do it. I mean, I grew up as an economist under a period when inflation was the worst possible tax imposed on the poor. I think the reconquest of macroeconomic stability in Brazil is one of the few real successes of the last 20 years that we are still retaining, and we shouldn't lose it. So we need to have more growth. We need to have more employment, but not just through macroeconomic policies. We need to look at the structural issues that are keeping our economy from being more efficient and address those. And I think the central bank has a mandate to look at inflation and is doing the right thing.
Thanks, Chico. So let me now turn to a topic that is gaining increasing recognition as well as concern in the region, food insecurity. Maximo, food insecurity has certainly increased in the region as a result of the pandemic. This, of course, affects the vulnerable population the most. The report provides some startling data. For example, it says that almost half of households in Ecuador and Honduras report running out of food in the last 30 days because of lack of money. What are, in your view, the best policies at the country level to deal with this very worrisome fact?
Thank you, Liliana, and thank you for the invitation, and very nice to see all of you, and thank you for Felipe for this nice report. Let me before I answer your question, Liliana, let me tell you that in our measurements, because we measure food insecurity, we have the food insecurity experience scale. The region has been one of the most affected in the world in terms of food insecurity. And there are two ways in which we measure what we call severe food insecurity and what we call moderate and severe. So moderate and severe is like tackling all forms of malnutrition. Severe is chronic undernutrition. And in terms of severe, Latin American region has been the biggest one, affected especially South America. Now, what is interesting is if you look at the report and look at the graph of informality, okay, urban and rural informality, we know that the region is around 54.4% of informality. That's what is reported in the report. And what I see clearly, for me at least, is that when you close the economy because of the lockdown, automatically you have a mirror in stopping economic income to these informal workers. And these informal workers are peri-urban, urban, and the rurals have been informal and were informal before, and they keep producing the rural areas because the food value chains keep moving. But the peri-urban and the urban that work on services, their income has been stopped abruptly. And that therefore affect people that were not poor before and could be even considering the low level of middle income, that immediately stop to have any income. They start to liquefy all their savings, and therefore they move into poverty. Now, what is the relationship with food insecurity? As I mentioned before, at the global level, the moderate food insecurity increased 14%. And in the severe, we increased 140 million people moving into food insecurity. In Latin America as a whole was 21 million moving into severe food insecurity. And in South America, we have 18 million moving into severe food insecurity. Now, the interesting fact that I was looking at Brazil, because I was really surprised by this issue of Brazil, is that if we look at Brazil, with data of Brazil and with our data, because Brazil also collects this food insecurity scale, they are pretty good at doing this. In 2020, there was a significant deterioration of the food insecurity for them also. So we don't see what we are observing in poverty. We see the opposite. We see an increase of food insecurity, and I can briefly show it to you. This is the graph. So basically, as you can see here, in all our measures, FAO is the red for severe, and then you have the equivalent measure for the case of the measurement of Brazil. So in both cases, we see an increase in severe food insecurity. So we are not observing what is observed in the measurement of poverty, which is also, if I am not incorrect, also official poverty measure. Now, what this could mean, at least for me, is a problem of targeting. And we have been observing when we look, for example, at countries in South America, and we look at the distribution of the food insecurity within the countries, we have seen significant new hotspots, which is very consistent with the deterioration of the middle class and moving into poverty, that are not normally part of the cash transfer programs. And that's one of the problems that Peru faced. They spend enormous amount of money transferring money, but to the incorrect people. The traditional ones that they were transferring, which was okay, but they couldn't get the people that was really being affected in the peri-urban areas. It could be that in Brazil something similar happened, and that's why we are seeing also food insecurity despite the poverty numbers are growing. But that inconsistency is extremely interested to go deeper and to study on that.
Thanks a lot, Maximo. The chart you have shown us is really concerning, really disturbing. And I think we could dedicate an entire event to this issue, and maybe we should. And I actually hope that this topic will be picked up by our audience in the question and answer segment. So let me dig deeper into the issues of inequality and the shrinking middle class that all of you have been mentioning so much. Chico, let me start with you. The report emphasizes the large inequalities that characterize the region, and everybody has mentioned that. What do you think are the long-term economic and social effects of persistent inequality in Latin America? And as the region recovers, how can countries deal with this persisting inequality, a problem that has been in the region for such a long period of time?
Okay, well, that's a tall order for like 2 or 3 minutes, but let me try. No, that's a great
You
question.
can take a couple more.
No. In terms of, it'd be very interesting to hear also Nora and Maximo on this, but in terms of the long-term effects and consequences, let me highlight two. One is we know that there is an association, causality is much debated, but there is an association between very high levels of inequality, which inevitably imply high levels of inequality of opportunity and lower levels of mobility. There's an association between that and lower growth. In large part because if large chunks of your population don't have the opportunities to invest in their own human capital or in a small business or whatever, you're wasting growth potential. Human potential gets wasted if opportunity is concentrated in the hands of a few. That is, I think, relatively well understood. And, there are all kinds of different growth regressions of inequality in them. But on the whole, if you look at the associations, I think that's what comes out. So, and we know that Latin America underperforms, has underperformed other areas of the world, including the developed countries. We've been diverging from the developed countries over the last few decades. And, a lot of, many parts of Asia have overtaken us, which were much poorer than us before. Now, is that entirely due to inequality? Maybe not, but I think inequality plays a role in that. So that's one effect. The other effect, and in this, actually, I'm drawing a little bit on this recent report, different report by the UNDP, which was coordinated by our other friends, Luis Felipe Lopez Calo and Marcela Melendez, on inequality and low growth in Latin America. They also emphasized the issue of violence. I mean, that's another thing where we are massive outliers, right? We have very, very high levels of violence, with death rates in some countries that only are comparable to those in war zones outside of Latin America. Again, is that clearly caused by inequality? There may be multiple other factors, but there is, some suggestion and some research out there that high levels of inequality weaken social trust, and by weakening social trust and social norms, they strengthen violence. So I think low growth and greater levels of violence and conflict are two long-term consequences. In terms of policies to address them, I mean, there are many, and some of the recipe is old, some of it is newer. Let me just say here, for the sake of time, that one thing I think we need to be very clear on right now at this particular time is that inequality is inextricably linked with vaccination. For the reason, in some sense, that related to what Maximo was talking about, which is that if you don't have vaccines and you don't have immunization, it's harder for you to go out and work. If you go out and work, you go out and work at great risk. You do, because if you're starving, that's what you do, but you go out at great risk. Everywhere we've looked, we've seen a correlation between the ability of economies to reopen and the rate of vaccination. And so this is the first order of priority for the region. Beyond that, and I don't want to go on for too long, but beyond that, and I'll put this here, maybe we can come back to it in questions, or Nora and Maximo may. But beyond that, there are issues around the design of tax systems, the level of tax rates themselves, but not everywhere. There's a taxonomy, like Nora was saying. Latin America is very heterogeneous. In Brazil, which raises a lot of revenue, perhaps in Argentina too, you wouldn't necessarily argue for very big increases in the overall tax stake. You would really focus on design. In other places like Mexico, perhaps Peru, there is actually room still for raising more revenue and using it efficiently and effectively. There's a lot that can be done on the expenditure side, redesigning programs, and there's a lot that can be done in terms of regulating market power and monopolies. And one could go on at greater length, but I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Chico. This is a topic that everybody in the panel has worked on. So do you, Nora, or Maximo, would like to expand on what Chico just said?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the long-term impact, I think, if you allow me, Liliana, I also like to connect with a couple of things, which, well, first of all, Maximo, what you found definitely has to be brought to bear and compare with what's happening on the poverty dimension, because the two data seem to be inconsistent. So that opens up an interesting discussion about whether it's a data problem or is it like targeting, is it something going on? And I think we need to look into it with much more care. The second thing, that, we've been talking about informality here, Liliana, I think that one interesting thing that we learned in the pandemic is that you can reach large numbers of the population with transfers relatively quickly, even those in the informal sector. That happened in Brazil. It happened also in Argentina. I haven't seen, may have happened in other countries. I haven't studied that. But so we have to, not necessarily in the best of ways. There's probably been lots of errors of inclusion, errors of exclusion. But at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, what are we going to do with this sector? There's no way that we're going to reach it because they're not part of the administrative registries. They're not part of the formal social insurance. But they could be reached. So we learned something, and it's something that we probably should look into more carefully to see what does it mean for the future. The second thing that I want to say, which is related to the longer term, and let me flip the question, because I want to belabor a point that I'm making in every panel that I am, which is the impact on education that Felipe mentioned earlier. That I think that with even though, with the recovery, moderate recovery, the reversal on the income shock will not be complete, there's going to be the ability to come back over the next 2-3 years, and that short-term income effect might be gone. We have to focus on the lasting scars. One of the lasting scars will come through the nexus that Maximo put forward, which is nutrition. I mean, if food insecurity means more malnutrition for the babies of today or the young children of today, that means that the human capital will be affected in the long term, and that will have an impact on poverty and inequality in the long term. The same thing with education. So education, what Felipe was saying is that you've had a tremendous shock. And as you know, we've been studying what that shock might mean in terms of high school completion rates and average years of schooling into the future, comparing what happens to children in low-income families and children in higher income families. And we found that the setback could be really very large. By some estimates, you could go back to the cohorts of the 1960s in terms of high school completion rates for the children who live in families of low education parents. That has a tremendous impact on inequality of opportunity in the future, and probably also inequality of outcomes. Earnings inequality could actually increase as a result of the change in the composition of the labor force by education. So two lasting scars that I think we need to focus and think about how quickly to avoid them to become really very lasting scars are nutrition, if the findings that Maximo has been illustrating recently, I mean, in the panel pan out, and education. And I think that the policy efforts have to really be concentrated in how to make the impact on human capital not irreversible. We need to reverse it. So that means a lot of things in terms of how spending will be allocated in the future. I think that certain policies will have to protect spending on certain sectors, because if you start cutting spending on education, you may actually worsen this, or if you cut spending on programs that address malnutrition, you're going to worsen this, and see where the resources to counter on the macroeconomic sphere what happened with the expansion this year. Where will they come from at the same time in a way in which you protect the human capital of the next generation?
Thank you, Nora. And your last point is very strong. Where will the resources come from? It looks like we have a big agenda, but multiple demands to meet with scarce resources that are getting scarce over, as time passes by. So that's an issue that we should dig a bit deeper. Maximo, would you like to add something on the
Yes,
issue?
so first to talk about the data I presented. So for the case of Brazil, we have two independent sources, no? The government, the measurement of the government, and our measurement. So for me, I am pretty confident on what we have. And it's not only Brazil, we did it for several countries in Latin America, Peru offshore, and we sent crews to check what we were getting. And the surprise is that the results will be are pretty important. They are coming out in the Washington Post in a special issue. But in any case, so the point that I want to make, which is linked to this, I think what the report of the bank brings is this, again, back the importance of the level of informality. I think that's a structural problem that we have in the region. And informality is a continuum, no? It's not a discrete formal or informal. There are several dimensions of informality. But what is telling us that a shock like the one we face basically could completely close any income revenue for these sectors, especially in the services sector. And that's where also another element of inequality, which is gender differences, play a crucial role. In agriculture, for example, the most affected were the part of packaging, processing, and so on, and most of the jobs there were female jobs. So again, exacerbates the differences that were already there because of this lockdown process. Now, the second thing that shows is that the policies implemented by the government, like my own country, were a disaster. They basically prolongated lockdowns unnecessarily for an enormous period of time when they didn't have even testing. So the lockdowns don't work if you don't have testing. There is no reason for you to isolate people if you don't test them. And that expanded the need to keep the closure for longer periods. And the consequence goes to a point where these people that are informal in the informal market start to lose their liquidity, and the liquidity that is the working capital. And if you look at the level of incomes of the informal sector in our economies, they were moved out of poverty for sure. They were even middle class, but they were informal. And when they lose their working capital, that's a crucial problem for them because they don't have access to financial markets. And all the programs of support for financial markets were for formal companies. So I think we have lost a huge opportunity during the COVID-19 to formalize these people because they needed things. And we could have used that as an incentive to formalize them. But the second problem, and linked to what Nora was saying, is the nexus is not only education, which could be dramatic, as you said, because we are losing 1 or 2 years of education in some cases. The second, and of course you have the people not enrolling again, especially again females. The second problem is the nutrition problem. So if this lockdown continues for more than 1,000 days, then that's a serious problem for the future generations. And the third issue is the vaccinations. So we are just worried about COVID-19 vaccines. But what happened with polio, with all the other things that we were resolved that are completely delayed? So the structural drivers of this structural poverty and problems of inequality have been exacerbated. So again, I think we need to find quickly a way to change this, because we will see consequences that will go farther than 2021, 2022, if we don't find a quick solution to this and we don't start to refocus how we do that. And the last element that I want to mention is what we have been observing in the region and also in other regions in Africa, for example, is countries didn't spend in rapid assessments to check where they should target most of their programs of assistance. They just continue to expand in volume, in size, their listings that they already have. And very few countries were sufficiently smart to do assessments that are not so expensive and that could help them enormously to identify where they should change their targeting. And that didn't happen in most cases. And that means that a lot of money went to areas that not necessarily need that expansion. No? A very nice example is India, no? where because people move to rural areas, they have a bumper crop. So the agricultural sector are doing extremely well, but they are focusing on sending money to other locations. So again, a lot to learn from this experience, and I think a huge missed opportunity to formalize more this economy, which is so informal for the region. Thank you again.
Thank you, Maximo. Again, you brought the issue of resource allocation that Nora also mentioned. I mean, using the resources for one purpose is actually could be crowding out the allocation of resources to another. So we have a bigger problem than that. The two of you also mentioned the issue of informality. And why don't we move into that a little bit more? Since it's so prevalent in the region, it's a particular characteristic of Latin America, the high degree of informality, that so much that in some countries, labor informality is estimated to reach 70% of the labor force. That is absolutely huge and not shared in any other region in the world, at least to that extent. So Chico, in regard to that issue, what do you think that policymakers can do to deal with the informality problem? Have there really been informality reducing policies, or keeping in mind large difference in the countries that everybody has mentioned, do current policies, in your view, actually encourage informality?
So a few things about informality. I completely agree with Nora and Maximo and with the report that Felipe oversaw, that informality has been a huge issue in this pandemic. I think that if we had comparable data, and to some extent where we do have comparable data, you find that in a lot of Africa, informality is as prevalent as it is in Latin America. It's just largely agricultural and subsistence agriculture to a very large extent. And I remember this from when we were working and when I worked on Africa for a period. And there are parts of Asia where that's the case too. To some extent, I do feel that informality is very strongly correlated with poverty at a national level and with inequality. It comes from workers being of very low productivity in a setting where the system has requirements for firms or minimum wages or other kind of requirements that just sort of truncate the labor market at a certain point and isolate them. In terms of policies to address that, I mean, it's interesting. It's a conversation to have with Maximo as well, who was saying we missed an opportunity to formalize them. I mean, I think that there are different kinds of formality as well. So one is, are you on some government database? Does the government have your address, your details, your tax number or something like that, which is probably easier to address. Informality in the labor market is more complicated because the government may have a lot of information about you, but it's really about your relationship with your employer, or whether you go to be a self-employed person, and that's much more complicated. In fact, we know that in most of Latin America, the same people transit between formality and informality a great deal. And so these are people that often are on the data, but because of circumstances around the labor market, exited. So what can we do about that? I mean, one thing that we've all been talking about, and many of you are in Washington, where this has been discussed at great length and in part through the influence of Santiago Levy, who's thought a lot about it, is the idea of thinking of the design of social protection systems and labor market regulation in Latin America, which he argues tax formality and subsidize informality, and creates this discontinuities and therefore encourages informality. I was recently, at this UNDP report launch, actually 2 days ago, I was on a panel there, and I argued that whilst that is important, I don't think it's the only thing. I mean, Maximo mentioned access to capital, and that's another very, very important, factor that the credit market's not working. Credit markets being very limited keep very small firms, including individual self-employed workers, from growing because they can't borrow against anything. And that in turn can be related, not exclusively, but it can be related to the fact that often our banking systems are highly concentrated. There's a lot of market power concentration. We have some of the highest banking spreads in the world in many regions, so in many parts of Latin America, including Brazil, which is related to market power and concentration, and may be a factor in preventing these markets to work. So there are issues around design of social protection, design of taxes. There are issues around enforcement too. It's not only about incentive design. In Brazil, under the Lula government, when the enforcement improved, there was an effect on formalization in some firms. And then there are issues around the credit market, but let me leave it there. I'm sure others will have more to add to that.
Thank you so much. And Nora, you raise your hand, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take on informality, and it's probably very controversial in a way. As I was saying exactly the opposite. We found that we can protect the informal sector market and quickly in some of the countries so that it didn't become a sort of major stumbling block as people thought at the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, I was very surprised to see that. And I think we need to learn why was it able to be done so quickly. The other thing is that I think we don't like informality in particular because that means that so many people are not protected from the different risks, right? But to protect all the people from all the risk would be very expensive. I don't know if the region can afford that, right? I have my doubts. So if you would like to have everybody to be formal and you would probably have to be much less demanding on the type of social protection you would be awarding everybody, because otherwise you would not be able to afford it. It doesn't mean that the current system is great. I'm not, but we have to be very careful. Is why are we not liking informality? What we don't like is the fact that a lot of people are really not protected against a number of risks. In addition, there may be labor market inefficiencies, etc. From my perspective, I worry about the fact that they're not protected. But it's not clear what the alternative would be, the best design alternative would be for the region. And this is something that there's a lot of thinking going into, and everything costs. And, Liliana, if you allow me, I want to bring in a topic that we have to think very carefully in the context of this hurt middle class discussion, which is the core of the report, of the World Bank report. We had a lot of largesse in all countries except in Mexico, and it's not very large, like in the context of Brazil, in terms of the expansion of fiscal deficits, debts, etc. We know that will have to retrench. It will retrench in part due with growth, because that will create more revenues, but probably there will have to be cuts and there will have to be increases in taxes. Who will bear the cuts? Who will pay for the additional taxes? And to what extent having to deal with a macro challenge which will actually worsen the situation of the middle class in the future? I think it's something that has to be taken very, very seriously. We've had lots of virulent reactions to attempts to increase taxes now in some of the countries. I don't think that will go away, because the pain that middle class is feeling is going to be there for a while. So politically it may be very hard, but also economically, if you want to protect the middle class from continuing to going downward, probably we have to think about how we're going to create those resources. Maybe Felipe has the answer.
Thank you so much, Nora. Yeah, absolutely. The issue of taxes is not going to go away. There is no way that we could be recommending having increased expenditures in the region, even if it's only to certain sectors, and at the same time not addressing the issue of increasing taxes. Because at the same time, the region is actually getting into increasing ratios of debt, international debt, which are actually threatening the sustainability of the whole macro picture. Yeah, that's another topic that we could devote a whole session to discuss. Keeping within the framework of our discussion, and still within informality, we know, and I wanted to, before moving into that, I wanted to also comment on Nora's comment, that there is also another link that we need to consider, and actually has been considered in the past a lot, and is the relationship between informality and very low productivity. That's another reason why people actually worry about informality, right? I mean, so that's one more topic for our agenda. So, Felipe told us about a positive point about the pandemic. And this is a question I would like to raise for Maximo. So Maximo, there are transformations that have accelerated during the pandemic, such as the boom in the digital economy. And they actually have the potential to help economic recovery and create new employment opportunities. What key measures of reforms should governments promote to capitalize on the potential of digitalization? And the reason why I relate this to informality is because the question is, can this really be done? Can digitalization be actually exploited to its max in the context of large informal populations that show a large preference for cash?
Thank you, Liliana. Let me quickly, if I can, touch a topic on the informality that we were talking about and how to formalize. I think if you look at the sectors that normally has been classified as lower productivity ones are the agricultural sector. And one of the reasons of that is seasonality, because farmers don't work all the year. And therefore, if you calculate regular productivity rates, they will be extremely low. Now, Peru did a very innovative law to formalize employment in the coast, which was flexible to seasonality. So basically, you can be hired formally for a period of time. That was the season of the crop. And that ended in full employment in the coast and an increase on the base in terms of payment of taxes and give formality to farmers. So again, the only point I wanted to make is that we can have flexible mechanisms that will allow to formalize and give them access to financial systems that they don't have normally, and also increase the base of taxes, which could be a solution given that you cannot increase immediately the rate. But going to your point, one of the major problems with digital technologies is the fact of the digital divide. So the report brings the increase in digital technologies, which is really good. It happened. It automatically, you start to find solutions to a problem of mobility, and therefore you start with e-commerce, with messenger services and digital mechanisms to be able to purchase. And that happened across the world. And the country that excelled on this was China, no? Because of all the mechanisms you have. But when you do e-commerce, you need to have three things. You need to have, of course, the platform. You need to have a mobile mechanism of money, which could be mobile banking or mobile money, which are two different things. Mobile banking requires a bank account. Mobile money doesn't require a bank account. But the third one, and most importantly, is you need to have a transportation system. So if you don't have a transportation system, you cannot move commodity. Now, if you look at your graph of access to cellular phones and digital technologies, but you split that by urban and rural, the story is very different. The digital gap still is pretty high there. Now, this is one of the areas where it's so cost effective for the public sector to do investments in infrastructure of deploying broadband. It's so cheap to deploy today broadband, but they don't do it. And nobody, I honestly don't understand still why they don't do it. The Broadband Commission has put the numbers out. It's so cost effective to do it. And the potential implications could be very high. So we have done studies of cost effectiveness in terms of poverty reduction, and digital technologies could be a solution for that. Now, the way to do it normally is that the government assumes the fixed cost of deploying the broadband, and then you give it in concession for competition. No? That's what you should do, not the government implement and carry out. But they can do this fixed cost, which is important and which, of course, has a natural monopoly type of mechanism. But then you create the regulatory mechanism to create competition, and then different providers could come up and do that. So that could be a way, but you need to reduce the digital divide. That's one component. The second component is capabilities, because you can have the most advanced digital technologies in the world, and if people don't know how to read and write, it's more difficult for them to use. Now, what we have found in our studies is that kids help a lot. So kids can help parents to do things, and that's upward intergenerational mobility. And they really help, and they have solved many problems to families. Even we're using that for extension services in the case of agriculture. And the third element is content and regulation mechanism. No? Why? Because, as I said, mobile banking is one thing, mobile money is another. There are countries that brought some of the laws of mobile money, for example, but the only thing they did is transfer all the market power to few players, like, for example, beer companies, because they need somebody that move cash in the mechanism, okay? Now, or telephone companies, sorry. Normally, like M-Pesa, they deal with telecom companies. In the case of countries like South America, beer companies also do that. So you need to think carefully your laws and try to innovate so that you also create not such a concentrated market in the cash flow so that you can create this mobile banking. But clearly, if you are able to reduce the digital divide, you can have a significant effect. And we know that infrastructure investments reduce inequality. So it could be a double win if we do it properly.
Thank you, Maximo. Felipe, perhaps it's time to bring you two into the conversation. You've been hearing lots of thoughts and recommendations from our panelists. So it would be nice to hear from you, how can the World Bank actually help support some of those recommendations that have been advanced so far?
Thank you. Thank you, Liliana, and thank you for all these great ideas. I feel like there's a lot of good things coming out of this discussion that I'm taking careful note about, that maybe we can borrow for discussions with our clients and see if we can take some forward. Let me make just maybe 3 very quick points from everything I've heard. So, I mean, the first one is, I think a lot of the discussion has focused on trying to use this data and this report to better understand what has happened, particularly on this area of how, how this shock has hit our economies and the families, and how the programs that the different countries have responded or not responded. And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about how to improve these programs and how to best deal with these very large shocks, because we hadn't had such a large shock in a very long time. And I'm not even sure the programs that have been used were designed for that. I think Chico mentioned that, and people have had to improvise across the countries, and we've improvised with a wide spectrum of things across the country. So I think there's going to be a lot to learn from that. The second point is, I think, and maybe it hasn't come out as clearly in this discussion, is that I think it matters where you are when a crisis of this magnitude begins. Because I'm thinking, for some countries, this crisis, they were doing quite well. I mean, let's not talk about countries in this region, but let's say China was growing at 5, 6, 7%. It was moving very quickly with low unemployment, fiscal buffers, and it mounted a response. A number of Asian countries mounted what seemed to be, from a distance, very professional and good responses. But in LAC, we have a good number of cases. I don't want to generalize, but we had a number of countries that were not growing, were deeply in debt, or their fiscal situation was running out of control, and had very little space to respond. So I do think that there are some big lessons that we'll need to draw on how to avoid being caught so flat-footed with such a big crisis. And then my third and final point is, I think what matters now in what we in the World Bank are trying to do is discuss with the countries is what's next. How do we move forward? How we get out of this? How can we speed up the recovery? How do we improve where we are? I'm very concerned, to be frank, and let me be candid, that I think many people are drawing many of the wrong conclusions. Many people, and I guess politics is getting in the way of many of the discussions, and some people are basically saying that, despite the fact that we managed to take a lot of people out of poverty for many years and grow the middle class, they think that what has happened over the last year or two is a demonstration that the system doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And hence, you need to elect me, somebody proposing wild new solution. So I think that's a very important discussion, and we do need to get back on track and build consensus around the right things that need to be done. I think the discussion here has been very rich in some of these areas that I would like the World Bank to continue to push on. I think there is a fiscal agenda that's very important now. I think Nora and others mentioned that this is not going to be easy. I mean, countries do need to get back on their fiscal feet, but but you can't just like raise taxes, in the midst of this. You will need to do this very carefully. You will probably need to use all the levers. We'll need to look at expenditures and wasteful expenditures and inefficiencies, and do this over gradually over a certain period of time. I think we need to push, at least from the bank side, a lot more the micro reform agenda, because many of the countries were not growing, barely growing when they came into this. And I think it was because the reform impetus had kind of run out of steam. And you cannot expect to grow and to grow robustly if you don't have investment, private sector creation of jobs. And I very, very much like this discussion you guys are having on digital, because I do think that the new jobs will need to be different, and they do need to be better suited to the new types of jobs that are going to thrive in the future. They're not the same ones that we had in the past. And for that, I think governments, as I think Maximo was saying, really need to quickly invest in access to digital to all, skilling to everybody who's interested, particularly young people, so that they can really move into this fast-growing sectors of the economy. So I think little by little, there is an agenda forming. We just need to, as World Bank, put it out there and invite people like you guys to support us on this.
Thank you so much, Felipe. I mean, certainly the agenda is is large and complex. And actually, we have a number of questions from the audience that are relating to many of the points that have been raised. And one of them you just mentioned that I think would be important to bring into the table is the challenges posed by the political changes in the region. So perhaps we should dedicate a few minutes to that very challenging topic. And the question to our panelists would be, to what extent the decline of the middle class might actually be affecting the rapid increase in social movements and manifestation of discontent in the region. So how do we put this element that has been so well discussed in the report and connected to the discontent that we are observing? So who would like to start from the panel?
Oh, if you want, I can.
Nora, okay, go ahead, please.
I mean, I think that we were witnessing this process already displaying itself before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was puzzling is, well, the region had emerged from a period in which inequality fell, the middle class grew, there were much more benefits going to people that never experienced them before. So why the discontent? And I think that what happened is that after the commodity boom was over, we saw like a stagnation of the improvement. People got used to sort of seeing things getting better. In addition, I think that we do see an increased polarization in terms of what happens to the elites. The elites continue to improve, and even if they improve relatively less, in absolute terms, they're always doing better and better. So there's a group society that always seems to be protected, shielded, and even during the pandemic, I think this is something that has not been mentioned. The middle class that invested in the stock exchange probably did very well in the region. So that portion, I don't know, I mean, I don't know if that is in your report, Felipe, but it'd be interesting to see what parts of the middle class are able to shield themselves from shocks because of the diversified portfolio. Part of them are savers, part of them maybe are not. I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting thing to look into. So I think that the fact that there's one group that continues to improve itself, its situation, when I am no longer improving or I'm deteriorating, actually angers people quite a bit. And I think that the pandemic has exacerbated that because, as I mentioned at the beginning, and this is also in the report, in our work, in your report and others, it is the middle sectors, the ones that have been affected the most, at least in relative terms, because they're the ones that had less protection from previous transfers and new transfers, and less protection from being part of the economy that continued to do well. So let me stop here. I'm sure others have, but by the way, you're asking economists to talk about something that political scientists do. But
it's about time, don't you think? Chico?
I want to say two things on this, which is a very important topic. I think political polarization in the region is a real threat and danger. You know, I mentioned earlier when I said inflation was threatening one of the few things we managed to save from our many gains, which was macroeconomic stability. I was also thinking about the threat under which democracy is in many countries at the moment, including my own. But also many others, and from both sides, right? From the hard left and from the hard right. I want to say a couple of things about the social unrest and so on. I wrote a blog some time ago where I said something about inequality and social unrest in Latin America, the Tocqueville paradox. And I would urge people who are interested in why the largest social protests in the region ecloded in Chile, a country where inequality had fallen quite a lot, where the middle class had grown quite a lot and was still growing. The deceleration in the growth of the middle class had happened in Brazil and Argentina, where there were no such protests at that time. There had been protests in 2013 when they were growing. So if you just Google Wikipedia on the Tocqueville paradox, I pulled it up here. It says, the phenomenon in which, as social conditions and opportunities improve, social frustration grows more quickly. And I think there was a lot of, frankly, to be honest, a lot of naive things said, oh, it's all about inequality. I study inequality, but the places like Chile and Colombia where the protests were the greatest were actually countries where the middle class was still growing at the time or had been growing until recently. And there is an element of what Nora said that people are expecting more and more, but there is the Tocqueville paradox is a real thing. It comes from political scientists. As things improve, people want more. And if the pace isn't the same, as Nora said, people are frustrated. That's one thing. The other thing, just very quickly, Latin America in this regard is part of a global trend. And that global trend is the sort of demise of the Clinton-Blair consensus. We had moved after the Cold War into this age where a reasonable left had appeared, and it was epitomized in my mind by these Clinton-Blair coalitions, which were the left's response, the left moving towards the center to respond to the Reagan-Thatcher era. And that was, in Latin America, it had the Concertación. In Chile, the many governments of the Concertación. In Brazil, it was Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and we had a number of others. And, there was this beautiful picture of the presidents of Brazil, Chile, and Argentina comparing the 1970s when you had these three dictators, white men in military uniform, with a time when it was Bachelet, Dilma, and Cristina Fernandez. Now, you might have reservations about one or another of these people, but it was a big change in who was running the countries. And now we have Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on and so forth. And I think part of it, and I'll end with this, part of it is that in the United States, as well as in Latin America and many other places, the Clinton-Blair left had a chance, but failed to capture the imagination. They failed to arrest the rise of inequality in the United States, for example. They failed to come up with a sufficiently radical paradigm. And radical doesn't mean going back to communism. That's what's really upsetting about this. There had to be some new thinking. Maximo keeps talking about it being creative. Something had to be thought about that would generate opportunities for the poorest people that is consistent with markets, and somehow that left, that I think many of us, to be honest, here actually admired, failed. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Chico. Maximo, your views.
No, thank you. So look, I agree in everything that has been said. I think for me, it's clear markets work, but there is a dichotomy between what macroeconomics say and what microeconomics do. Macroeconomics will say, okay, we stabilize the economy, we are doing okay, there is no inflation, we have enough reserves, we did our job, we are successful. But you microeconomists are not doing your job because you have a lot of problems of inequality and so on and so forth. And the truth is that macroeconomics is based on microeconomic foundations. So they are related to each other. And if we don't tackle both things at the same time, then we have the problems that we are facing. And I completely agree with Nora. For me, inequality is relative, it's not absolute. And polarization, which is the tails of the distribution, creates a big problem, which is related to aspirations. No, as Chico said, as you move up, you want more. And the problem is we didn't assess the importance of the velocity of moving these people up into the middle class. Yes, we were improving, but it could be that we needed a different velocity so that they keep receiving a price to their aspirations and keep receiving what they were expecting. And that has created an exacerbation of the situation. And when you have a shock like COVID-19, which basically destroys all this middle class, which was informal, then that exacerbates even more. And then you see that people really don't care. They become risk lovers. They don't care because what they will lose? They become a short-time horizon. In the short term, yes, they will give me a piece of land. They will give me more money. What's the problem? If you remember the time of Alan Garcia, in the hyperinflation period of Alan Garcia in Peru, if you do a survey of who were the happier people in those times, were the poorest. Because they were indexed, remember? The public salaries were indexed and so on and so forth. So again, I think we are moving from a longer period of time to a closer period of time, and people increase, they become more risk lovers, and they increase their perception, and they are willing to take the risk and just think in the short term or in the medium term, and therefore they don't care about this macroeconomic stability. And that's something that we need to bring a lot of evidence to show, because if you are a left side government, this is the best opportunities for you, because if you can have a stable macroeconomy, and then you can do a lot of things that normally you won't be able to do if you don't have that stability. So I think these are also, again, another way that we can bring evidence to try to make them take advantage of this opportunity rather than trying to destroy them because they are on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you, Maximo. Well, we are reaching the end of our conversation. This has been an incredibly fruitful discussion. Of course, I cannot pretend to summarize such a rich discussion, but it's clear that we all agree that the pandemic have exacerbated fragilities, that a number of fragilities that were already in the region before the COVID-19 eruption, included severe problems in education, health systems, and food security. There are new challenges for the region, but there are also positive elements. The new challenges, in addition to the micro, as Maximo have put on the table, are also related to the macroeconomy, and both Chico, Nora, Maximo, you have all mentioned that where are the resources? I mean, we have so much to do and so little resources on the table. If something the pandemic has brought on the macro front, there has been this increased indebtedness for many countries in the region. And actually the fear of downgrades from credit rating agencies that have already been taking place, and actually there could be more coming up in the forthcoming months. And that's a huge a challenge that the region, in my view, cannot deal with its own. And that's where the multilateral organizations come into play too. There is no way that the circle can be closed if we think that in the short term or even in the medium term, the region can have enough resources to deal with the multiplicity of issues that is dealing with right now. We have news also on the positive side, and this that at least at this moment, the external environment is being favorable, right? Including the increase in commodity prices. The question, of course, is whether that increase in commodity prices that helped the region in the golden years of the 2004, 2014, could be, if those gains could actually be replicated again or not, especially in the context of the so much political divergence as we are experiencing right now. including protests for exploitation of the mining sectors, for example, in some of the countries. So there are many issues now that are adding into the complexity of the phenomenon. And as also many of you have mentioned, there is also the hope of the digital economy, something that there is really an open door for progress that perhaps can be used effectively. Well, I only have to thank all of you for this very rich discussion. I'm sure that our audience have enjoyed it as much as we have, and we have to repeat, and we hope to repeat it soon. This was great. Thank you to all. Goodbye.